The destroyer's sonar operator pressed his headphones closer, straining to hear through the Atlantic's chaos. 300 feet below, something metallic moved against the current. March 1945, and U-boat U-546 was about to become the last German submarine sunk in combat. Above her, escort carrier USS Bogues aircraft circled like hunting hawks. 4 destroyer escorts closed in from different compass points. The submarine commander knew he was trapped. This wasn't how it started. 4 years earlier, German U-boats owned these waters. Let me take you back to November 1942. Convoy on 154 struggles through mountainous seas. 45 merchant ships carry Britain's lifeline. Food, fuel, ammunition, everything needed to survive. Then the wolves strike. 20 U-boats coordinate their attack with deadly precision. Radio chatter crackles between submarines as they position for the kill. Within 3 days, 14 ships burn and sink. 30 to 60 men per ship thrown into freezing water. Most die within minutes from hypothermia. British escorts follow standing orders. Don't stop for survivors. Stopping means becoming the next target. Admiral Karl Dönitz watches from his headquarters in France. His submarines are winning. In 1942 alone, they sink over 1,600 Allied merchant ships. That's more than 4 vessels every single day disappearing beneath the waves. The math is brutal, but simple. Sink 700,000 tons per month, and Britain starves within a year. Dönitz has the submarines to do it. His wolf packs grow larger and more coordinated each month. The tactics are devastatingly effective. U-boats gather in patrol lines along known convoy routes. When they spot merchant ships, they surface at night. Diesel engines screaming, they race ahead of lumbering cargo vessels. Before dawn, they dive and attack from inside the convoy's protective screen. British escorts, spread impossibly thin across 60 or 70 ships, can only watch helplessly as torpedoes find their marks. Churchill later called it the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. The Battle of the Atlantic was killing Britain by degrees, but something remarkable was happening on the other side of that same ocean. Something that would turn submarine hunters into the hunted. Rewind to March 1941. America is still officially neutral. Pearl Harbor won't happen for 9 months. Yet U.S. Navy officers are already watching British convoys struggle and die. Captain Paul Heinemann sits in London, sending report after report to Washington. He describes chaos he witnesses firsthand. Escorts without standardized communication procedures. Merchant captains who've never trained together. Anti-submarine warfare techniques that haven't evolved since 1918. The British are courageous, no question. But they're improvising desperately with resources stretched across a global empire. American planners see an opportunity to learn from blood someone else has already shed. The U.S. Navy establishes the Atlantic Fleet Support Force in March 1941. 10 destroyers and a radical idea. Instead of throwing together whatever ships happen to be available, they'll create permanent escort groups. Groups that train together until coordination becomes instinctive. Commander Donald McIntyre, a British escort veteran, visits Norfolk that summer. He's stunned by what he sees. American destroyer crews practice anti-submarine tactics 8 hours daily. They run mock attacks against their own submarines. They study Wolfpack communication patterns intercepted by British intelligence. They're building doctrine while Britain is still just trying to survive. The centerpiece is something the British barely attempted. Aggressive escort tactics. British doctrine, born from desperation and insufficient resources, is purely defensive. Stick close to the merchant ships. Wait for an attack. Respond if you can. Rear Admiral Arthur Bristol flips that thinking completely. His directive from September 1941 reads like a different philosophy of war. The primary objective is to destroy the enemy. Protection of shipping is secondary, and will be achieved through destruction of the threat. This aggressive mindset shapes everything. American escort groups train to immediately counterattack any U-boat contact, even if it means temporarily leaving merchant ships less protected. The logic is cold, but sound. A U-boat running for its life isn't torpedoing anything. A U-boat on the bottom will never threaten another convoy. British escorts make brief attacks, then hurry back to formation. U-boat commanders learn they can dive, wait 20 minutes, and resume hunting. American escorts learn to hunt U-boats for hours, calling in reinforcements, forcing submarines deep until their batteries die. When December 1941 arrives, these aren't theoretical plans anymore. They're tested systems ready to scale up. Fast forward to spring 1943, the same waters where British convoys lose 20% of their ships. American escorted convoys cross with losses that shock German naval intelligence. 2%, sometimes 0. The contrast isn't subtle. It's a complete reversal of fortune. Understanding why requires looking at what arrived from American shipyards. Vessels specifically designed to kill submarines, and they arrived in numbers that changed Dönitz's mathematical equation. The destroyer escort, designated DE, smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers. These ships could be mass-produced using technology that didn't compete with other war priorities. They displaced 1,400 tons, carried 3-inch guns, depth charge racks, and enough fuel to cross the Atlantic twice without refueling. Between 1943 and 1945, American yards delivered over 500 of these ships. For context, Germany built 162 U-boats during the entire war. The United States was building submarine hunters almost as fast as Germany built submarines. But the real revolution came from above the water. The escort carrier, CVE, Navy designation nicknamed Jeep carriers. These gave convoys their own air cover for the first time. These weren't massive fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown. They were merchant ship hulls fitted with flight decks, capable of carrying 20 to 30 aircraft. Slow as the merchantmen they protected, but fast enough to keep up. USS Bogue joined convoy duty in March 1943. Her air group flew Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighters, aircraft that could spot U-boats from miles away and attack with depth bombs before submarines knew they'd been seen. The tactical impact was immediate and devastating. U-boats had previously surfaced during daylight to charge batteries and make high-speed runs into attack position. Now doing that meant appearing on a radar screen and having half a ton of explosives dropped on you within minutes. Convoy HX-233 in April 1943 demonstrated the new reality. Bogue's aircraft spotted 4 U-boats shadowing the convoy. All 4 were forced to dive, losing contact with the merchant ships. One, U-203, was caught on the surface and sunk by depth bombs. The convoy crossed without losing a single merchant ship. German after-action reports from surviving U-boat commanders show confusion and fear replacing the confidence they'd felt just months earlier. Then Americans introduced something the British never had resources to attempt: hunter-killer groups. These were entire task forces, an escort carrier plus 4 or 5 destroyer escorts that didn't escort convoys at all. They hunted U-boats independently, using intelligence from decrypted German communications to position themselves where wolf packs were forming. Captain Daniel Gallery commanded one of these groups aboard USS Guadalcanal. His philosophy was simple: we're not here to escort anything. We're here to sink submarines. In June 1944, His group accomplished something no naval force had done in the war. They captured a German U-boat intact, U-546, boarding it before the crew could scuttle it and seizing its Enigma machine and code books. The technology race was moving too fast for Germany to keep pace. All the ships and aircraft in the world meant nothing if you couldn't find the enemy. In early 1943, finding a submarine in the Atlantic was like finding a needle in an ocean-sized haystack. The British had radar, but their systems operated on wavelengths around 1.5 meters, effective for spotting surface ships, nearly useless for detecting the low profile of a surfaced U-boat in rough seas. U-boat commanders knew this. They surfaced at night, confident that darkness and wave clutter made them invisible. That confidence died when American escorts began arriving with centimetric radar operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths. This British invention, shared with Americans and mass-produced in their factories, could spot a submarine conning tower from 10 miles away, even in moderate seas, and it could do it at night. U-boat commander Peter Kremer described the shock in his memoir. "We surfaced at midnight to charge batteries as we'd done 100 times before. Within 10 minutes, star shells were bursting overhead, and we were crash diving with destroyer propellers audible through the hull. We had no warning, no radar detector alarm, nothing. German radar detectors called METOX were designed to pick up 1.5-meter wavelength signals. They couldn't detect centimetric radar at all." Between February and May 1943, this technology gap cost Dönitz dozens of U-boats. The Americans coupled this radar advantage with high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, pronounced Huff Duff by crews. This system triangulated the source of radio transmissions. German U-boats transmitted constantly. Wolfpack tactics required submarines to report convoy positions to headquarters, which would then coordinate the attack. Every transmission was a beacon. American escort groups carried HFDF equipment as standard. Operators became incredibly skilled. A U-boat commander might send a 30-second position report and find destroyers racing toward his location within the hour. Dönitz refused to believe Allied direction finding was accurate enough to target individual submarines. He was wrong. By late 1943, U-boats were under orders to maintain radio silence except for critical reports. This crippled the Wolfpack coordination that had made them so effective. Underwater, the technology gap was just as severe. American destroyers and destroyer escorts carried the QC sonar system, significantly more sensitive than British ASDIC. More importantly, they carried new weapons that exploited that sensitivity. The Mark 24 mine, actually an acoustic homing torpedo called FIDO, was dropped by aircraft and would actively hunt for submarine propeller noise. U-boat commanders had no defense against it. Standard evasion tactics like crash diving and running silent didn't work if the weapon was listening for you and chasing you down. The first operational use came in May 1943, when an Avenger from USS Bogue dropped one on U-456. The submarine's crew heard nothing until the torpedoes struck their pressure hull. U-456 sank with all hands. Over the next 2 years, FIDO accounted for 37 confirmed U-boat kills. The final piece was intelligence, and here the advantage was almost unfair. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had cracked the German Enigma cipher system, reading U-boat communications sometimes within hours of transmission. This ultra-intelligence was shared fully with American convoy planners. They knew where wolfpacks were forming, which routes they were targeting, even which U-boats were low on fuel and heading home. Convoys were routed around known submarine concentrations. When combat was unavoidable, American commanders knew how many U-boats they faced and approximately where. This wasn't just a technological edge. It was fighting with the enemy's playbook in your hands. Dönitz never suspected the Allies were reading his mail until after the war ended. By May 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz faced a crisis that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. His U-boats were dying faster than they were sinking ships. In that single month, 41 U-boats were destroyed, nearly one per day. Allied ship losses dropped to the lowest levels since America entered the war. The mathematics of attrition warfare had reversed catastrophically. Building a U-boat took roughly 6 months and required increasingly scarce materials and skilled labor. Training a crew to operational effectiveness took another 4 months. American shipyards were launching a destroyer escort every 3 days and training crews in 8 weeks. Dönitz was losing a battle of industrial capacity he'd never calculated into his strategy. The wolf pack tactic itself became a liability. The system required submarines to congregate in patrol lines and communicate frequently to coordinate attacks. Every radio transmission gave HFDF operators a bearing. Every submarine on the surface charging batteries was a radar target. The more U-boats Dönitz concentrated in an area, the more targets American hunter-killer groups had to prosecute. Convoy ONS-5 in May 1943 demonstrated the complete reversal, a heavily defended convoy that destroyed 6 attacking U-boats without losing a single merchant ship. U-boat commanders who survived these encounters filed reports describing American escorts that seemed to know exactly where they were at all times. The psychological impact was severe. Crews that had once hunted confidently now spent their patrols dodging attacks, diving at every radar contact, knowing that surfacing meant potential death. Dönitz tried adapting. In September 1943, he pulled U-boats back from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely, redeploying them to less heavily patrolled areas, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, the waters off West Africa. This strategic retreat bought time but sacrificed the primary objective. Convoys crossing the critical North Atlantic route to Britain now faced minimal opposition. The supplies that mattered most crossed unmolested. The introduction of the acoustic torpedo, the German T-5 Zonkönig or Wren, seemed like a potential game-changer when deployed in September 1943. This weapon homed on the propeller noise of escort ships, promising to eliminate the hunters protecting the convoys. Initial results were promising. Several escorts were hit, but American technical intelligence teams captured an intact T-5 within weeks. Reverse engineered it. Developed a simple countermeasure called the Foxer, a noise-making device towed behind ships that decoyed the torpedo away from the actual vessel. Within 3 months, the T-5's effectiveness dropped to nearly zero. By early 1944, Dönitz was ordering U-boats to remain submerged for entire patrols, using snorkel devices to run diesel engines underwater. This made them nearly impossible to detect by radar or aircraft, but it also made them slow, nearly blind, and unable to coordinate attacks. The submarine arm that had nearly strangled Britain was reduced to isolated boats, making occasional opportunistic attacks. The May 1944 statistics told the story. U-boats sank 6 merchant ships that month in the North Atlantic. 6. In May 1942, they'd sunk 122. American convoy doctrine hadn't just defeated the U-boat threat. It had rendered it strategically irrelevant. When Operation Overlord launched in June 1944, thousands of ships crossed the English Channel to invade Normandy. Not one was sunk by a U-boat. The Battle of the Atlantic was over, and Dönitz knew it. The human element often gets overlooked. The U.S. Navy invested heavily in training escort crews to a level of proficiency the resource-starved Royal Navy simply couldn't match during the desperate early years. The Submarine Chaser Training Center in Miami established in 1942, ran continuous 8-week courses. These put crews through realistic combat simulations. Destroyers and destroyer escorts practiced attacks against American submarines playing the enemy, learning to interpret sonar returns, coordinate depth charge patterns, execute night surface actions. By the time these ships reached the Atlantic, their crews had already fought dozens of engagements. British escorts, by contrast, often learned anti-submarine warfare on their first actual patrol, with predictably deadly results. Commander Frederick Walker, one of Britain's most successful U-boat hunters, visited American training facilities in late 1943. He wrote that American junior officers showed tactical awareness that took British officers 2 years of combat to develop. The reason was systematic education. Every American escort officer attended a 4-week anti-submarine warfare school before their first assignment, studying actual combat reports, analyzing successful attacks, learning from other people's mistakes. The Navy compiled after-action reports from every convoy engagement and distributed lessons learned bulletins monthly. Tactics that worked were standardized and taught. Mistakes that cost lives weren't repeated. This created an organizational learning curve that improved performance across the entire Atlantic fleet, not just among individual ships that survived long enough to gain experience. The rotation system maintained this edge. British escort crews in 1942 were running convoy after convoy with minimal rest, crossing the Atlantic 8 or 9 times without proper shore leave. Exhaustion leads to mistakes. Sonar operators missing contacts. Captains making poor tactical decisions. Crews too tired to maintain equipment properly. American escort groups operated on a sustainable schedule. 2 convoy runs, then 2 weeks in port. Those 2 weeks weren't vacation. They included refresher training, maintenance, and integration of new equipment. But they also included actual leave, time with families, recovery from the physical and mental stress of convoy duty. Research from the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery in 1944 showed that alert performance on escort duty declined significantly after 60 consecutive days at sea. American planners kept crews below that threshold. The result was escorts that maintained peak performance throughout their deployments. Morale played a measurable role. American destroyer escort crews knew they had the best equipment, the best training. Most importantly, they were winning. U-boat kills were celebrated, shared across the fleet, used to build confidence. The Navy published the Hunter Killer newsletter highlighting successful actions, making heroes of successful captains and crews. This wasn't just propaganda. It was building institutional identity around excellence. Contrast that with U-boat crews by late 1943. They knew the odds. German naval records show that 75% of U-boat crewmen who went to sea after mid-1943 never returned. That knowledge, that you were statistically more likely to die than survive your service, destroyed effectiveness even among survivors. U-boats returned to port with crews requesting transfers. Morale reports describing near mutinous conditions. Commanders reporting their men were fought out. The Americans also benefited from crew stability. Escort groups stayed together for months, building the kind of intuitive coordination that can't be taught. The commander of a destroyer escort group learned his captain's tendencies, their ship's capabilities, could coordinate complex maneuvers with minimal radio communication. British escort groups were constantly reshuffled as ships went in for repairs or were reassigned to other theaters. Every convoy might mean working with different ships, different commanders, different tactical doctrines. American groups like Captain Gallery's Task Group 22.3 operated together for over a year, developing an effectiveness that treated submarine hunting as a team sport where everyone knew the plays. Ultimately, the Atlantic battle came down to a contest of industrial production. In that contest, Germany never stood a chance. At peak efficiency in 1943, German shipyards delivered approximately 20 U-boats per month. That same year, American shipyards delivered an average of 45 destroyer escorts and escort carriers per month, more than double the rate of submarine construction. But the numbers get more staggering when you add merchant ship production. The United States launched Liberty ships at a pace that still defies belief. 18 shipyards working simultaneously, building cargo vessels in an average of 42 days from keel laying to launch. The record was 4 days and 15 hours for the SS Robert E. Peary in November 1942. Germany was sinking ships in a bathtub that America was filling with a fire hose. Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast revolutionized maritime construction by applying assembly line manufacturing principles. Prefabricated sections were built inland, transported to shipyards, and welded together. Workers who'd never built ships before became productive members of construction teams. Women, minorities, people considered too old for military service, were trained in weeks. Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California employed over 90,000 workers at its peak and launched a completed Liberty ship every 36 hours on average. By war's end, American yards had delivered 2,710 Liberty ships alone, not counting the hundreds of faster Victory ships, tankers, and specialized cargo vessels. Each one represented cargo capacity the convoys could afford to lose, except they weren't losing them anymore. Aircraft production showed the same overwhelming advantage. In 1943, American factories delivered over 85,000 military aircraft. Germany produced approximately 25,000. The U.S. Navy received hundreds of Avenger torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighters specifically for anti-submarine patrol. Aircraft built in such numbers that losing one, while tragic, was operationally irrelevant. New pilots and planes arrived faster than combat could deplete them. German U-boat commanders described the skies over the Atlantic becoming infested with American aircraft by late 1943. They weren't exaggerating. The U.S. Navy operated over 100 escort carriers by 1944, each carrying 20 to 30 aircraft. That's 2,000 to 3,000 anti-submarine aircraft at sea, not counting long-range patrol bombers operating from land bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Britain. The technology advantage was also an industrial one. Centimetric radar required cavity magnetrons, complex devices that were difficult to manufacture. British labs invented them, but British factories couldn't produce them in quantity. American companies like Raytheon and General Electric did, eventually delivering thousands per month. By 1944, every escort vessel, every patrol aircraft, every escort carrier carried centimetric radar as standard equipment. Germany never developed an equivalent system. Their radar technology remained stuck at longer wavelengths that were relatively easy to detect and jam. The gap wasn't just scientific. It was manufacturing capability translated into tactical advantage. Even crew production favored the Americans. The Navy expanded from 383,000 personnel in 1941 to over 3.4 million by 1945. Training facilities processed this expansion without collapsing. Boot camps, technical schools, officer candidate programs all scaled up simultaneously. Recruits became qualified sonar operators, radar technicians, damage control specialists in months. The Germans were conscripting teenagers into U-boat crews by 1944, sending them to sea with minimal training because experienced instructors were dead and training facilities were bombed. American crews arriving in the Atlantic in 1944 were often better trained than German crews with combat experience, because the German experience was 6 months of running and hiding rather than actual tactical development. Dönitz later wrote that he knew by mid-1943 that the U-boat campaign was mathematically unsustainable, but Hitler refused to acknowledge defeat. U-boats continued sailing into an Atlantic that had become their graveyard, not because they could win, but because the Führer demanded they fight. Of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned, 785 were destroyed. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, roughly 30,000 died. Those ratios, 75% losses, represent the most dangerous military service of any nation in World War II. They also represent what happens when tactical skill meets industrial capacity it cannot match. Now, back to March 1945. U-546 sits trapped beneath the surface, her batteries dying. The American escort group above knows exactly where she is. Sonar pings echo through her hull like a death knell. When she finally surfaces, 4 destroyer escorts are waiting. Her commander raises a white flag. The last combat U-boat surrenders to the same systematic approach that destroyed the entire submarine arm. The victory in the Atlantic didn't end when Germany surrendered in May 1945. It became the foundation for how Western navies think about convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare to this day. The tactics, technologies, and organizational structures developed during those desperate years were codified into NATO doctrine when the alliance formed in 1949. The concept of permanent escort groups training together, aggressive hunter-killer tactics, integrated air and surface operations. These weren't abandoned after the war. They were refined, expanded, and became the standard approach for protecting sea lanes against submarine threats. Soviet submarines during the Cold War faced the same systematic approach that destroyed the U-boat arm. Updated with jet aircraft and nuclear-powered escorts, but fundamentally unchanged in philosophy. The escort carrier concept evolved into the modern amphibious assault ship and the light carrier designs used by navies worldwide. The principle remained identical. Provide mobile air cover wherever it's needed. Don't rely on distant land bases or massive fleet carriers that can't be everywhere at once. When Britain fought the Falklands War in 1982, their success depended heavily on the carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. Direct descendants of the escort carrier concept, providing air cover to a task force operating 8,000 miles from home. American amphibious groups today look remarkably similar to Captain Gallery's hunter-killer groups from 1944. Just with helicopters instead of Avengers and guided missiles instead of depth charges. The technology tree that branched from Atlantic convoy battles reshaped naval warfare completely. Centimetric radar evolved into modern air search and surface search radar systems. HFDF direction finding became the foundation for electronic warfare and signals intelligence. Sonar technology from World War II evolved into the sophisticated passive and active sonar arrays that modern anti-submarine warfare depends on. The Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo Fido was the direct ancestor of every modern anti-submarine torpedo. Even the organizational structure survived. The U.S. Navy's current Maritime Patrol and Reconnaissance Force traces its lineage directly to the anti-submarine patrol squadrons formed in 1943, flying updated aircraft but executing fundamentally similar missions. The human factor's innovations proved equally durable. Modern naval training emphasizes realistic simulation, systematic analysis of combat performance, and institutional learning. all principles established during the Atlantic Campaign. Crew rotation policies that prevent exhaustion. Induced errors became standard across all services. The concept that technology advantages mean nothing without trained operators who understand how to exploit them is now foundational to military education. Staff colleges teach the Atlantic convoy battles as case studies in organizational learning. The importance of doctrine, how systematic approaches defeat individual heroism over time. Perhaps most importantly, the Atlantic victory demonstrated that modern naval warfare is fundamentally about systems rather than individual ships or commanders. The British had brilliant escort commanders like Walker and McIntyre, but brilliant individuals couldn't overcome systemic disadvantages in resources, training, and coordination. The Americans succeeded not because their individual ship captains were better. Many were green and inexperienced, but because the system supporting them was superior. Standardized doctrine meant every escort group fought effectively. Industrial capacity meant losses were replaced faster than they occurred. Training programs meant inexperienced crews performed at high levels. Intelligence sharing meant everyone fought with the same information. This systems-based approach to warfare became the American military's defining characteristic. Integrating training, doctrine, intelligence, technology, and industrial production into a unified whole. When modern strategists discuss sea lane security, anti-access area denial threats, or protecting maritime commerce, they're discussing problems the Atlantic convoy battles solved 80 years ago. The specifics have changed. Chinese submarines instead of German, satellites instead of HFDF, helicopters instead of Avengers. But the fundamental challenge remains identical. How do you move critical supplies across hostile waters when an enemy wants to stop you? The answer developed between 1941 and 1945 still applies. Overwhelming industrial capacity, superior technology, aggressive tactics, systematic training, and the organizational structure to coordinate all of it effectively. That's why American convoys crossed U-boat waters while everyone else sank. And it's why those lessons remain relevant whenever nations depend on the sea. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won by heroes, though there were many. It wasn't won by secret weapons, though technology played a crucial role. It was won by a system that turned warfare into a science and applied that science with overwhelming force. In the end, the U-boats didn't lose because they lacked courage. They lost because courage alone couldn't overcome mathematics. And the mathematics of American industrial production made their defeat inevitable from the moment the first Liberty ship slid down the ways.